Outside, the temperature at Atigun Pass has dropped to 47 degrees below zero. The wind is coming off the Brooks Range at 40 miles per hour. The road ahead is a narrow ribbon of packed snow and gravel, climbing toward the highest point on any Alaska highway maintained year-round. And somewhere on that road, alone, a truck driver is preparing to sleep. Not in a hotel. Not in a heated building. Inside the cab of an 18-wheeler, in the middle of one of the most remote stretches of road in North America, with nothing between that driver and the Arctic night but insulated metal, engineered heating systems, and a century of hard-learned knowledge about what it takes to survive in a place like this. Most people, confronted with conditions like these, would do the only rational thing. They would stop, find shelter, wait for something to change. But that option rarely exists for the men and women who keep the Dalton Highway moving through winter. Because the road does not close because a driver is tired. The cargo does not wait because the temperature is dangerous. And the people at the far end of that 414-mile corridor, the oil workers, engineers, and support staff living at Prudhoe Bay near the Arctic Ocean, they need what is on that truck, whatever the thermometer says. If you watch this on television, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this episode with someone nearby. It costs nothing, but it means everything to how this channel grows and how many more stories like this one we can tell. So tonight, we are going to follow that driver. We are going to understand not just what they experience on the Dalton Highway in deep winter, but how the place where they sleep has evolved across an entire century. From a time when sleeping in a truck meant folding yourself into a wooden box with no insulation and no heat, to a modern era when a sleeper cab can hold a full-sized mattress, a refrigerator, a television, and a climate control system sophisticated enough to maintain a comfortable temperature, while the world outside is cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. This is the story of survival, engineering, and the 100 years of progress that separates a coffin on wheels from a home on the road. To understand where the modern Arctic trucker sleeps, you first have to understand where it all started. And the beginning is darker and stranger than most people imagine. The 1920s were a period of rapid expansion for American trucking. Paved roads were becoming more common. Longer routes were becoming possible. By 1920, most trucks had recently been upgraded to pneumatic air-filled tires, replacing the solid rubber versions that made earlier journeys brutally rough. And for the first time, drivers were being asked to travel distances that could not be completed in a single day. The problem was immediate and obvious. Where does the driver sleep? There was no answer to that question in the truck itself. Early commercial vehicles of the 1920s were primitive by any modern standard. Cabs were open or only partially enclosed. There was no heating system. The suspension transmitted every rut and rock directly into the driver's body. And when darkness came and the driver needed to rest, there were few options along most American roads. There were no truck stops. There were no rest areas designed for large vehicles. So drivers improvised. And the improvisation they arrived at was something that became known, with grim appropriateness, as the coffin sleeper. The coffin sleeper was exactly what the name suggests. A narrow compartment, typically built from wood or thin metal, attached to the back of the cab or sometimes mounted beneath it in the space near the engine. It was roughly 18 to 24 inches high, about 3 feet wide, perhaps 6 feet long, which is to say just long enough for a human being to lie flat. If that human being was not particularly tall and did not mind keeping their elbows close to their sides, the mattress, if you could call it that, was often a padded bench. There was no insulation against cold. There was no ventilation against summer heat. And critically, there was no internal access from the cab. A driver who wanted to use the coffin sleeper had to stop the truck, climb out into whatever weather existed outside, open a separate exterior door, and fold themselves into the compartment from the outside. If the weather was good, this was merely unpleasant. If the weather was severe, it was genuinely dangerous. The name was not an accident. These compartments looked like coffins. Drivers called them coffins, and in the most extreme conditions, that comparison was not purely metaphorical. Road debris thrown up by the truck could damage the compartment. Carbon monoxide from the engine could seep in if the seals were poor. A crash from the rear would reach the sleeping driver before any other part of the truck. These were not exaggeration. They were documented risks that drivers accepted because the alternative was sleeping in the seat, hunched over a steering wheel that was essentially a direct connection to a rough road. What kept those drivers alive through winter nights was not engineering. It was layering. Heavy wool coats, multiple blankets, a body-generated heat that had to do the work that no machine was doing for them. In the coldest regions, where temperatures could drop well below zero, a driver in a coffin sleeper was relying on the same fundamental principle as anyone sleeping outdoors in winter. Trap as much body heat as possible and hope the night is short. Now transpose this situation to Alaska, not the Dalton Highway, because the Dalton did not exist until 1974. Imagine the drivers and haulers who moved supplies through Alaska in the first half of the 20th century across routes that were often trails, often frozen rivers, often barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. The coffin sleeper was their technology for rest. The Arctic winter was their environment. And the gap between those two facts was bridged only by experience, stubbornness, and a tolerance for physical hardship that most people today would find almost incomprehensible. Through the 1930s, manufacturers began to respond. Kenworth, based in Seattle and deeply connected to Pacific Northwest and Alaska markets, is widely credited as one of the first major manufacturers to offer a factory-integrated sleeper berth by the early 1930s. It was still basic. A bunk built directly behind the cab, now accessible from inside. Slightly better insulation, slightly more space, but it represented a fundamental shift. The idea that the place where a driver slept was not an afterthought bolted to the truck after the fact, but part of the vehicle's design from the beginning. Progress through the 1940s and 1950s was slow. A driver sleeping in a 1948 truck was sleeping better than one in a 1928 coffin sleeper, but not dramatically so. The berths were narrow. The insulation was basic, and heating came from the truck's engine cooling system, which meant that if the engine was off, the heat was off. In northern latitudes in January, that created its own separate crisis, because turning off the engine in extreme cold was a decision that could leave a driver stranded. Here is something that most people have never considered about sleeping in a truck in winter. Even if the sleeping space itself is adequately insulated, even if a driver has enough blankets to maintain body temperature through the night, the truck itself presents a separate and potentially catastrophic problem. Diesel fuel begins to gel and thicken at temperatures around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. At -20, it can become so viscous that fuel systems struggle to function. The engine's lubricating oil thickens dramatically. And in the 1940s and 1950s, a truck driver who turned off their engine on a cold Alaska night faced the very real possibility of a truck that would not start in the morning. A truck that would not start in the morning, in a remote location with no communications, was not a logistical inconvenience. It was a survival crisis. So drivers kept their engines running through the night, idling, burning fuel, generating enough heat from the engine to keep vehicle systems from freezing, and enough warmth through the cab for some form of rest. This was expensive, hard on the engine, and produced exhaust around the vehicle that created additional health risks. But it was the lesser of several dangerous alternatives. This is why experienced Arctic drivers of that era developed a sixth sense for engine sound that went beyond normal mechanical awareness. They could hear, even in sleep, the change in engine note that might signal a problem. A driver in a 1950s sleeper berth was never truly off duty. They were resting while remaining partly alert, one ear always tuned to the mechanical heartbeat of the machine their life depended on. The Dalton Highway came into existence in 1974, built by the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company in just 5 months to support construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Before the road existed, the corridor between Fairbanks and Prudhoe Bay was not a place where trucks traveled in winter. After it was built, it became one of the most demanding trucking environments in North America. 3 communities along 414 miles. No cell service along most of the route. Coldfoot at mile 175, with a population that hovers around 30 people, serving as the only significant fuel and services stop in the entire 240-mile stretch between the Yukon River Camp and Dead Horse. And in winter, temperatures that can remain well below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time, with wind that turns already dangerous cold into something far more lethal. When carriers like Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, and Alaska West Express began running loads up the haul road regularly, the trucks were already significantly better than their 1950s predecessors. But the fundamental challenge of sleeping safely in extreme Arctic cold had not gone away. It had simply evolved alongside the technology trying to address it. By the 1970s and 1980s, sleeper cab design had become a serious engineering discipline. The spaces behind the cab grew from narrow bunks to genuine living compartments. Double berths became common. Insulation improved dramatically. And gradually, the trucking industry began addressing a question that had defined the coffin sleeper era but had never been truly solved. How do you keep a driver warm through an Arctic night without running the main engine all night long? The answer that emerged was the auxiliary power unit, and it changed Arctic trucking in ways that are difficult to overstate. An APU is a small, separate diesel-powered generator mounted on the truck, typically on the frame behind the cab. It has its own fuel supply and its own exhaust. When a driver shuts down the main engine to sleep, the APU continues running, providing electrical power to the sleeper cab's climate control system, to the driver's electronic devices, to the refrigerator and microwave that now come standard in many modern sleepers. The APU consumes a fraction of the fuel that idling the main engine would burn. It is quieter, and it keeps the sleeper cab at whatever temperature the driver sets, regardless of what is happening outside. On the Dalton Highway at 47 degrees below zero, this is not a convenience. It is the reason the driver survives the night. Because here is what 47 below actually means for a human body. At that temperature, exposed skin can develop frostbite in less than 10 minutes. Metal touched without protection will pull moisture from skin and cause immediate injury. The temperature differential between the outside air and a properly heated sleeper cab might exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The APU is maintaining that differential, quietly, through the night, burning roughly a gallon of fuel per hour while the driver sleeps. A driver in a modern sleeper on the Dalton with a functioning APU climbs down from the cab after a federally mandated 10-hour rest period, feeling something that their counterpart from 1925 would not have recognized as a trucking experience. Rested, warm, ready. The truck has been kept from freezing. The cargo is intact. This is what a century of engineering progress looks like from the inside. But the gap between then and now is not only about warmth. It is about the totality of the sleeping environment and what that environment does to the human being who inhabits it day after day across the months of an Arctic winter. Modern sleeper cabs like those in the Kenworth T680 or the Freightliner Cascadia are not hotel rooms. They are compact, thoughtfully engineered, and built to function in conditions that would destroy most living spaces. The mattress in a standard sleeper might be 60 inches long and 36 inches wide, narrower than a twin bed. The ceiling height in the sleeping area might barely allow sitting upright, and the entire space shares a wall with a working truck that, when moving, vibrates and generates a constant ambient noise that drivers must learn to sleep through. What modern engineering has provided is not luxury. It is controlled survivability. The insulation in a current production sleeper is many times better than what existed in a 1960s berth. The climate control maintains a set temperature automatically. The noise dampening, while imperfect, is significantly better than earlier generations. The mattresses are genuine foam, not padded benches. And the APU means that a driver can set the temperature, close their eyes, and trust the system to hold their environment through the night. This represents a profound shift from the coffin sleeper era. In 1925, sleeping in a truck meant continuous low-level alertness, a half-consciousness that was never truly rest. The compartment could be invaded by cold at any moment. The physical discomfort of the space fought against recovery at every moment. What those drivers experienced was something closer to suspended animation than genuine sleep. Modern understanding of sleep science gives us language for what that cost. The deep sleep stages required for physical and cognitive recovery. The stages during which memory consolidates, cellular repair happens, and the hormones regulating metabolism and stress are reset. Those stages require temperature stability, sustained predictable sound, and a sleeping surface that allows the body to fully relax. The coffin sleeper of the 1920s provided none of these things. The driver's body spent resources through the night fighting cold and discomfort, resources that should have gone toward recovery. They woke depleted, and on roads with none of the safety infrastructure that exists today, they drove depleted. On the Dalton Highway today, the challenge of sleep is still real. It is just different. A driver pulling north from Fairbanks in January, carrying equipment for the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, operates on a route with no cell service for most of its length. They carry a satellite phone as their link to the outside world. If something goes wrong, help may come slowly. A documented incident near Atigun Pass involved a driver whose diesel exhaust fluid system crystallized at extreme temperature, causing the truck's computer to trigger a power reduction that slowed the rig to 5 miles per hour in blizzard conditions. The driver contacted dispatch on a satellite phone. Another driver eventually reached them. The tow back to Fairbanks alone cost $15,000. This is the hidden tension in modern Arctic trucking. The trucks are incomparably better than their predecessors in almost every measurable way, but they are also more complex. A coffin sleeper could not malfunction in interesting ways. It was a wooden box. A modern sleeper cab with APU, climate control, emission systems, and computer-managed engine functions has hundreds of potential failure points, some of which only manifest in the specific combination of extreme cold, remote location, and continuous operation that defines the Dalton Highway in January. Experienced drivers on the haul road learn which systems to monitor carefully. They carry backup heating sources, small diesel-fueled auxiliary heaters independent of the main APU, because if the APU fails at 40 below, the backup is what keeps the driver alive through the night. They carry extra fuel treatment additives specifically formulated to prevent diesel gelling in extreme cold. They know the locations of every pullout along the route where stopping is relatively safe, because stopping on the wrong section of the Dalton, on a slope, in wind, in the dark, creates risks that multiply quickly. They also know something that no piece of equipment can teach: when to stop and when not to. Atigun Pass, at miles 241 to 247, sits at an elevation of 4,639 feet. It is the highest road pass in Alaska accessible year-round by vehicle. In a blizzard, at night, at 40 below, it is not a place where the difference between a good decision and a bad one is measured in inconvenience. It is measured in survival. Experienced drivers develop a relationship with the pass that is difficult to explain. They know how the wind behaves at different points along the approach. They know the sections where the road surface changes in ways that affect traction. And they know that when conditions deteriorate past a certain point, the right answer is often to find a safe location south of the summit, activate the APU, set the climate control, and wait. This is what the outside world tends to miss about Arctic trucking. The drama is not always in the driving. Sometimes the most skilled and consequential thing a driver does is stop. A driver in a 1920s truck, on a route approximating what the Dalton would become, faced that same decision to stop with no technological support on the other side of it. The coffin sleeper offered no refuge from the cold that did not depend entirely on the driver's own body. There was no system to set, no temperature to dial in, no quiet machine maintaining their environment through the night. There was a wooden box, a blanket, and a body fighting to maintain core temperature through an Arctic darkness. The driver in a modern sleeper with a functioning APU and a satellite communicator wakes with something closer to genuine restoration. Not fully recovered, because no sleep in a moving truck on a remote highway fully replicates undisturbed rest in a stable environment, but closer to functional than any driver in 1925 could have hoped to be after a night in a coffin. And that distance, that narrowing of the gap between what rest is supposed to provide and what a driver on a remote Arctic highway can actually achieve, is what a century of engineering, federal regulation, and hard-won practical knowledge has built. It is not glamorous. Nobody films the moment when a driver in the Brooks Range sets the APU temperature, draws the sleeping curtain, and closes their eyes to the sound of a small diesel engine doing exactly what it was designed to do. But that moment is real, and it matters. And it represents the end of a long road that began with a wooden box and the simple, stubborn insistence of the people who drove those early trucks, that whatever conditions the world offered, they would find a way to rest, recover, and keep moving. The next time you see a truck in winter darkness, headlights cutting through falling snow, think about the space behind that cab. Think about what it took to get from a coffin sleeper to a climate-controlled berth 100 degrees warmer than the air outside. And think about the driver resting there, preparing for what the road ahead still requires of them. Because wildfire season is coming. And the corridors that drivers navigate through smoke and flame, where visibility collapses and the air itself becomes a hazard, reveal a completely different kind of danger. A challenge where the enemy is not the cold at all, but everything that burns,